The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Margaret Thompson sat on her front porch, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 68, she had the kind of face that told stories without words, deep lines around her eyes from years of laughter and tears, silver hair pulled back in a simple bun, and hands that showed the evidence of a lifetime of hard work. The old wooden chair creaked beneath her as she rocked gently, watching the world wake up around her. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson was already tending to her flower garden, and the sound of children getting ready for school drifted from the houses nearby. It was a peaceful scene, one that Margaret had grown to cherish in the 3 years since her husband Robert had passed away. But today felt different. There was tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press down on the small town like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Margaret had heard the whispers, seen the worried looks exchanged between neighbors. The Thompson gang had been spotted in the area, and everyone knew what that meant. The Thompson gang, no relation to Margaret despite sharing the same last name, was a group of 5 men who had been terrorizing small towns across the county for the better part of 2 years. They were led by Jake Thompson, a man in his 30s with cold blue eyes and a reputation for violence that preceded him wherever he went. His younger brother Danny was just as ruthless, perhaps even more so because of his unpredictable temper. The other 3, Marcus, Billy, and Sal, were followers but dangerous ones who would do anything Jake told them to do. Margaret knew their story well. Everyone in the county did. They had started as petty thieves, robbing convenience stores and gas stations. But as law enforcement began to close in on them, they had become more desperate and more violent. Just last month, they had robbed a bank in Cedar Falls, 40 miles north of Millbrook. During the robbery, Jake had shot and killed an elderly security guard who had tried to stop them. The man had been only days away from retirement, a father of 3 and grandfather of 7. The incident had shocked the community and put every small town in the area on edge. Local police were stretched thin, and the state authorities were struggling to track down the gang. They seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts, striking quickly and vanishing before law enforcement could respond. Margaret set down her coffee cup and walked back in her house. The screen door squeaked as it closed behind her, a sound that Robert had always promised to fix, but never quite got around to. Now it served as a reminder of his presence, a small comfort in the quiet moments. The house felt too big for just one person. It was a modest 2-bedroom home that she and Robert had bought 45 years ago when they were newlyweds. Every room held memories. The kitchen where they had shared countless meals and late-night conversations. The living room where they had watched their daughter Sarah take her first steps. The bedroom where Robert had died peacefully in his sleep on a cold February morning. Sarah lived in California now with her own family. She called every week and visited twice a year, but Margaret knew she worried about her mother living alone in what was becoming an increasingly dangerous area. Sarah had been begging Margaret to move to California, to sell the house, and come live near them. But Margaret couldn't bring herself to leave. This house, this town, it was where she belonged. As she moved through the familiar rooms, Margaret's eyes fell on an old wooden box sitting on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was a simple thing about the size of a shoebox, made of dark walnut with brass hinges that had tarnished with age. Most visitors to the house assumed it contained family photos or important documents. They were wrong. Margaret had never told anyone what was really in that box. Not even Sarah knew the full truth about her mother's past, about the woman Margaret had been before she became a wife and mother in this quiet little town. The box contained a gun, a Smith & Wesson Model 29 revolver with a 6-inch barrel. It was nearly 50 years old, but had been meticulously maintained. The blue steel still held its shine, and the wooden grips showed only the slightest wear from years of careful handling. To most people, it would have appeared to be nothing more than an old gun, perhaps a family heirloom or collector's piece. But this gun had a history, a very specific, very deadly history. Margaret had been born Margaret Riley in a rough part of Chicago. Her father had been a police officer, and her 3 older brothers had all followed in his footsteps. Growing up in a family of cops in one of the most dangerous cities in America had taught her things that most young women never learned. By the time she was 16, she could field strip and reassemble a pistol blindfolded. By 18, she could outshoot any of her brothers at the police range. But Margaret's true talent wasn't just marksmanship. It was an almost supernatural ability to read situations and people. She could sense danger before it materialized, could spot a threat from across a crowded room. These skills had served her well during her brief but intense career as an undercover police officer in Chicago's narcotics division. For 3 years, from age 21 to 24, Margaret had lived a double life. To the world, she was just another young woman trying to make her way in a big city. But to the Chicago Police Department, she was one of their most effective undercover operatives. She had infiltrated drug rings, gambling operations, and organized crime families. Her innocent appearance and sharp mind made her the perfect spy. It was during this time that she had earned her reputation with the revolver. In those 3 years, Margaret had been forced to draw her weapon exactly 7 times. 7 times she had fired a single shot. 7 times that shot had found its target with lethal precision. 7 criminals who had threatened innocent lives or tried to kill her had met their end at the wrong side of Margaret's gun. The department had nicknamed her One-Shot Riley, though the name was kept strictly confidential. Even among her fellow officers, only a select few knew about Margaret's perfect record. It wasn't something she was proud of. Taking a life, even in the line of duty, was never something to celebrate. But she had never missed when it mattered, and she had never hesitated when innocent lives hung in the balance. Her undercover career had ended when she fell in love with Robert Thompson, a gentle accountant she had met while working a case involving financial fraud. Robert knew she was a police officer, but she had never told him about her perfect shooting record or the 7 men who had died by her hand. She had put that life behind her, choosing love and family over the dangerous world she had known. But now, sitting in her quiet living room with the morning light streaming through the windows, Margaret could feel the old instincts stirring. The Thompson gang was coming. She could feel it in her bones the same way she used to sense trouble on the streets of Chicago. And when they arrived, they would find what they thought was a helpless old widow living alone in a house full of valuables. They would be wrong about the helpless part. Margaret walked to the mantelpiece and carefully lifted the wooden box. Her hand showed no tremor as she opened the brass clasp and lifted the lid. The revolver lay nestled in red velvet, looking as deadly as the day she had first held it. Beside it were 6 bullets, their brass casings gleaming in the morning light. She had cleaned and maintained the gun religiously over the years, even though she had hoped never to use it again. Once a month, she would take it apart, clean every component, oil the moving parts, and check the action. It was a ritual that kept her connected to the woman she had once been, even as she embraced the peaceful life she had chosen. Margaret lifted the revolver from the box, feeling its familiar weight in her hand. Everything about it felt right. The balance, the grip, the smooth action of the cylinder as she checked the chambers. This gun had saved her life 7 times in Chicago, and now, after 30 years of retirement, it might be called upon to do so again. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of the neighborhood. Children playing, lawn mowers starting up, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. But underneath it all, Margaret sensed something else. A wrongness in the air, like the stillness that comes before a tornado. She had learned to trust these feelings long ago. They had kept her alive in situations where hesitation meant death. And, right now, every instinct she possessed was telling her that danger was coming to Millbrook. Margaret closed the box and returned it to the mantelpiece, but kept the revolver in her hand. She walked to the front window and peered through the curtains. The street looked peaceful enough, but she noticed that Mr. Peterson's dog was agitated, pacing back and forth in the yard and whining softly. Animals often sensed danger before humans did. The phone rang, startling her from her surveillance. Margaret set the gun on the coffee table and answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson? This is Sheriff Morrison. I wanted to call and check on you." Sheriff Morrison was a good man, though Margaret often thought he was too trusting for his own good. He had been elected sheriff 3 years ago on a platform of community policing and cooperation, which worked well for dealing with teenage pranks and domestic disputes. But Margaret wasn't sure he was prepared for the kind of violence the Thompson gang might bring to his town. "I'm fine, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" "Well, ma'am, we've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area. The state police think the Thompson gang might be heading this way. I wanted to make sure you know to keep your doors locked and to call us immediately if you see anything unusual." Margaret almost smiled. If she called the sheriff's office, every time she saw something unusual, the phone lines would be jammed. Her training had taught her to notice things that most people missed. Cars that didn't belong, people who watched too carefully, movements that suggested hostile intent. I appreciate the warning, Sheriff. I'll be careful. Is there somewhere you could go? Maybe stay with a friend until this blows over. Margaret looked at the revolver on her coffee table. I'll be fine here, Sheriff. This is my home. There was a pause. Mrs. Thompson, these men are extremely dangerous. They've already killed one person, and they won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way. I really think, Sheriff, Margaret interrupted gently, I've lived in this house for 45 years. I bury my husband from this house. I'm not about to let a bunch of criminals scare me away from it now. Another pause. Yes, ma'am. I understand. But please call us if anything happens. We can have a patrol car there in 5 minutes. 5 minutes, Margaret thought. In her experience, 5 minutes might as well be 5 hours when violence erupted. But she thanked the sheriff and hung up the phone. She spent the rest of the morning going through her daily routine, but with heightened awareness. She watered her small garden behind the house, noting the best sight lines and potential cover. She walked to the mailbox, observing which neighbors were home and which houses appeared empty. She made lunch, but positioned herself where she could watch the street while she ate. By afternoon, the feeling of wrongness had intensified. Margaret could see it in the behavior of the animals. Dogs were restless. Birds seemed agitated. Even the squirrels in her oak tree were chattering more than usual. Nature had its own early warning system, and right now it was sounding an alarm that only she seemed to hear. At 3 o'clock, she saw the first sign of real trouble. A black sedan with tinted windows drove slowly down her street, the driver clearly studying the houses rather than simply passing through. The car was too new and too clean for this working-class neighborhood, and the way it moved suggested surveillance rather than someone looking for an address. Margaret stepped away from the window, but continued watching through a gap in the curtains. The car made another pass 15 minutes later, this time going even slower. On the third pass, it stopped directly in front of her house for nearly 30 seconds before moving on. They were casing the neighborhood, probably looking for the easiest targets. A lone elderly woman in a well-maintained house would certainly fit that description. Margaret felt a familiar coldness settle over her, the same emotional shift that used to happen when she was about to go into a dangerous situation. Fear and anxiety were replaced by calm focus and deadly intent. She went upstairs to her bedroom and changed into dark clothes, black jeans, a dark blue sweater, and soft-soled shoes that would move silently across the hardwood floors. Then she returned to the living room and picked up the revolver. The gun felt good in her hands, like shaking hands with an old friend. She opened the cylinder and loaded all 6 chambers, then checked the action one more time. Everything was perfect. Margaret positioned herself in the front room, where she could watch both the front door and the street. She turned off the lights and settled into Robert's old recliner, the one that gave her the best view of the entire front yard. The revolver lay across her lap, hidden but ready. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Margaret Thompson, former undercover cop, widow, and grandmother, prepared for what she knew would be her final test. Somewhere out there, 5 dangerous men were planning to rob and possibly kill what they assumed was a helpless old woman. They had no idea they were about to meet someone who had never missed when it mattered most. Someone whose gun had never failed to find its target. Someone who had been waiting 30 years for a chance to prove that some skills never rust, never fade, and never fail when the moment of truth arrives. The stage was set. The players were in position. And Margaret Riley Thompson was ready to remind the world why they used to call her One Shot. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky when Margaret heard the sound she had been waiting for. The low rumble of multiple engines approaching from the east end of town. She glanced at the clock on the mantel, 9:47 p.m. Late enough that most of her neighbors would be settling in for the night. Early enough that the streets wouldn't be completely empty. Perfect timing for what the Thompson gang had planned. Margaret remained perfectly still in Robert's recliner, her breathing slow and controlled. The revolver lay across her lap, its weight familiar and comforting. Through the front window, she could see the street lamp casting pools of yellow light along the sidewalk. Her front yard was partially illuminated, giving her a clear view of anyone who might approach the house. The engine sounds grew closer, then stopped. Car door slammed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Margaret's count was automatic and precise. All 5 members of the gang had arrived, just as she had expected. She could hear voices now, low and urgent, though she couldn't make out the words from this distance. For a brief moment, Margaret allowed herself to think about her daughter Sarah, safe in her California home with her husband and 2 children. Sarah called every Sunday evening, always worried about her mother living alone. If she could see Margaret now, armed and waiting in the darkness for killers to arrive at her door, she would be terrified. But she would also be surprised to learn about the woman her mother had been before becoming the gentle wife and grandmother Sarah remembered. Margaret pushed thoughts of her family aside. She needed total focus now, the kind of ice-cold concentration that had kept her alive on the streets of Chicago. Personal emotions were a luxury she couldn't afford when violence was imminent. The voices were getting closer. Through the darkness, she could make out shapes moving along the sidewalk. 5 figures approaching her house with the confidence of men who believed they held all the advantages. They moved in a loose formation, probably thinking they looked casual to anyone who might be watching. But, to Margaret's trained eye, their positioning was clearly tactical. 2 men were flanking wide to cover the sides of the house, while the other 3 approached the front door directly. These weren't random criminals stumbling through their first robbery. They moved with purpose and organization, suggesting military or law enforcement training. That information filed itself away in Margaret's mind automatically. Dangerous opponents required different tactics than ordinary street thugs. The 3 men at the front of the group stopped at the edge of her front yard. One of them, a tall man with broad shoulders, appeared to be their leader. Even in the darkness, Margaret could sense his confidence, the way he carried himself like a man accustomed to being obeyed. This would be Jake Thompson, the gang's leader, and the man who had killed the security guard at Cedar Falls. Remember, Jake's voice carried clearly in the still night air. The old lady lives alone. Should be easy money. House like this probably has cash, jewelry, maybe some valuable antiques. We get in, get what we need, and get out. No unnecessary noise, no witnesses. One of the other men, younger, with nervous energy that Margaret could detect even from a distance, shifted impatiently. What she wakes up, where she calls the cops. Then, we deal with it, Jake replied coldly. Same as we always do. Margaret's grip tightened slightly on the revolver. Jake Thompson was planning to kill her if she caused any trouble. In his mind, she was already dead. He just hadn't decided whether it would be necessary yet. This wasn't a simple robbery. This was a home invasion by men who would murder her without a second thought. The knowledge brought a strange sense of peace. Margaret had never killed anyone who didn't deserve it, never taken a life unless it was absolutely necessary to save innocent people. But these 5 men had forfeited their right to mercy the moment they decided to invade her home with murder in their hearts. The 2 flanking men had disappeared into the shadows on either side of the house. Margaret knew they would be checking for back doors, basement entrances, any way to approach the house unseen. Let them look. She had chosen her position carefully. From this chair, she could cover every entrance to the living room, and the living room was the center of the house. Anyone who wanted to reach the other rooms would have to come through her first. The front porch creaked as someone stepped onto it. Margaret could see a shadow moving past the window, someone trying to peer inside without being seen. The motion sensor light by the front door hadn't activated, which meant they had been careful to avoid its detection range. These men had definitely done this before. A soft scratching sound came from the direction of the front door, someone working on a lock with tools. Margaret wasn't surprised. The lock was old and basic, the kind that would take an experienced burglar less than a minute to defeat. She had never bothered to upgrade her security because she had always known that her real protection didn't come from locks and alarms. The scratching stopped. A moment later, Margaret heard the soft click of the door opening. Her pulse remained steady, her breathing calm and controlled. This was the moment she had been preparing for all day, really, the moment she had been preparing for since she retired her badge 30 years ago. The woman who had been one-shot Riley was about to meet 5 men who thought they were predators, but were actually walking into the den of something far more dangerous than they could imagine. Soft footsteps moved across the hardwood floor of the front hallway. Margaret knew exactly where they were, 3 steps inside the door, moving slowly toward the living room where she waited. A floorboard creaked under someone's weight, the same board that had been loose since she and Robert moved into the house. She had never bothered to fix it because it served as an early warning system for anyone approaching from the front entrance. The footsteps paused. Then a whispered voice. "Jake, you getting anything from the back?" The response came from somewhere behind the house. Kitchen doors locked tight. "Working on it now." "How about the basement?" "Checked it. Old storm doors, but they're chained shut from the inside. We're going through the front and kitchen." Margaret smiled grimly. They were professionals, all right, but they were making the classic mistake of assuming their target was helpless. In their experience, elderly widows didn't fight back, didn't have weapons, didn't know how to use them, even if they did. Their overconfidence would be their downfall. The footsteps resumed, closer now. Margaret could see a shadow moving along the wall of the hallway, someone trying to navigate in the darkness without turning on any lights. Smart thinking, but ultimately useless. Margaret knew every inch of this house, every squeaky board and loose nail. She could move through it blindfolded if necessary. The shadow paused at the entrance to the living room. Margaret remained perfectly still, controlling even her breathing to make no sound that might give away her position. To the intruder, the room would appear empty, just dark shapes that could be furniture or anything else. A small pen light clicked on, its beams sweeping across the room. Margaret was positioned behind the high back of Robert's recliner, invisible unless someone walked completely around the chair. The light moved past her hiding spot, illuminating the coffee table, the fireplace, the television in the corner. "Clear," the intruder whispered. "Wrong," Margaret thought. More footsteps from the back of the house indicated that the kitchen door had been defeated as well. Now, she had enemies approaching from two directions, exactly the kind of tactical situation she had trained for decades ago. Multiple threats, limited visibility, the need to act quickly and decisively before they could coordinate their attack. The man with the pen light stepped into the living room, moving toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. He was looking for Margaret, assuming she was asleep in her bed, unaware that death was stalking through her house. From behind him, Margaret could see his silhouette clearly. Medium height, wearing dark clothes, some kind of tool belt around his waist for his lockpicking equipment. A second figure appeared in the kitchen doorway. This one was larger, moving with the heavy footsteps of a man who wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. They thought they were safe now, inside the house with their victim apparently unaware of their presence. Margaret waited. Two men were in position where she could see them clearly. Three more were still outside or approaching from other directions. She needed to be patient to let them commit themselves before she acted. Rush too early, and the ones outside might escape or call for backup. Wait too long, and they might discover her position before she was ready. The man with the pen light reached the hallway and started toward the bedrooms. The larger man moved from the kitchen into the dining room, his bulk clearly visible against the window. Still no sign of the other three. Then, she heard voices from the front porch. Two more men entering through the door that had been left open. "Anything yet?" one of them asked. "Danny's checking the bedrooms. Marcus is sweeping the back rooms," came the reply. "Should have the old lady in a minute." For men inside the house now, Margaret's mental count was automatic and precise. One more still outside, probably standing guard or watching for police. The odds are getting better. The man in the hallway, Danny, apparently, called back toward the living room. Bedroom's empty. Bed's been slept in, but no one there now. Confusion in his voice. They had expected to find Margaret asleep and helpless. Instead, they were discovering that their victim wasn't where she was supposed to be. "Check the bathroom," Jake's voice commanded. "Maybe she's in there." "Already did." "Empty." More silence. Margaret could practically hear them thinking, trying to figure out where an elderly woman could be in her own house at 10 o'clock at night. They weren't panicking yet, but the uncertainty was starting to affect their confidence. "Maybe she's visiting someone," one of the men suggested. "Car's not in the driveway." Margaret had moved her car to the garage earlier that afternoon, anticipating exactly this moment. Let them think she was away from home. Let them relax their guard and make mistakes. "Doesn't matter," Jake said. "We're here. We're inside. Take everything valuable and let's go." The man called Marcus emerged from the dining room, carrying what appeared to be a silver candlestick, part of the set Margaret and Robert had received as a wedding gift. Seeing her possessions in the hands of these criminals sent a flash of anger through her, but she controlled it instantly. Anger was an emotion. Right now, she needed to be a weapon. "Check that wooden box on the mantel," Jake instructed, pointing toward Margaret's hiding place. "Looks like it might have jewelry or something valuable." Marcus moved toward the fireplace, passing within 6 feet of Margaret's position. If he had looked down and to his left, he would have seen her sitting in the chair with the revolver across her lap. But his attention was focused on the mantelpiece and the wooden box that supposedly contained her gun. Margaret almost smiled. They were about to discover that the box was empty, while the gun itself was pointing directly at them. Marcus reached for the wooden box and lifted the lid. Even in the darkness, Margaret could see his confused expression as his fingers found nothing but empty velvet lining. "It's empty," he reported. "Empty." Jake moved closer, his suspicion finally beginning to surface. Why would someone keep an empty box on display? That was the moment Margaret had been waiting for. Both men were facing away from her, focused on the mystery of the empty box. Danny was still in the hallway, out of her immediate line of fire. The fourth man was somewhere in the dining room. Perfect positioning. Margaret rose from the chair in one smooth motion, the revolver coming up to eye level with practiced precision. Her movements were silent, controlled, deadly. The men didn't hear her, didn't see her, didn't realize that death had just positioned itself 6 feet behind them. Because, Margaret said softly, "The gun isn't in the box anymore." Both men spun toward the sound of her voice, but Margaret was already moving. 30 years of retirement hadn't dulled her reflexes or slowed her reactions. If anything, the decades of patient waiting had compressed her skills into something even more dangerous than they had been in Chicago. The revolver bucked in her hands once, the sound impossibly loud in the confined space. Marcus dropped like a stone, the silver candlestick clattering to the floor beside him. He had been reaching for a gun in his waistband when Margaret's bullet found the center of his chest, but his hand never completed the draw. Jake was faster, already pulling his own weapon when Margaret's second shot took him to the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying across the room. He hit the wall hard, leaving a smear of blood as he slid to the floor. "Danny!" Jake screamed. "She's got a gun." Footsteps pounded down the hallway as Danny rushed toward the sound of gunshots. Margaret was already moving, using the confusion and darkness to reposition herself. She rolled behind the couch just as Danny appeared in the living room doorway with a sawed-off shotgun in his hands. The shotgun boomed, tearing chunks out of the wall where Margaret had been standing moments before. Plaster rained down from the ceiling as Danny pumped another round into the chamber. "Where is she?" he shouted to his wounded brother. Jake was holding his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "Behind the couch. Watch out, she's fast." Margaret smiled grimly. They still didn't understand what they were dealing with. They thought they were fighting a lucky old lady who had managed to get her hands on a gun. They had no idea they were facing someone who had been trained to kill efficiently and without hesitation. From her new position, Margaret could see the fourth man, the one from the dining room, moving carefully along the wall toward her hiding spot. He had a pistol in his hand and was trying to flank her position while Danny kept her pinned down with a shotgun. 2 more shots left in the cylinder. 5 men total, 2 down, 3 still active. The numbers were getting manageable, but Margaret knew she had to act quickly before they could coordinate their attack or call for backup. The flanking man was almost in position. In another few seconds, he would have a clear shot at her from the side while Danny covered the front. Margaret had to break up their coordination before they could execute their tactical advantage. She rose slightly and fired her third shot, not at either of the men but at the floor lamp in the corner. The heavy brass base toppled over with a crash, and in the moment of distraction that followed, Margaret rolled across the room to a new position behind the piano. Danny's shotgun boomed again, but the pellets shredded the couch where Margaret had been hiding moments before. The flanking man cursed and adjusted his position, trying to reacquire his target in the darkness. "She's moving," he called out. "I can't get a clean shot." Margaret was counting shells. Danny had fired twice, which meant he had at most 6 or 7 shots left, depending on what kind of shotgun he was carrying. The flanking man hadn't fired yet, but most criminals carried cheap pistols with limited ammunition. She needed to make them waste their shots while conserving her own. From her position behind the piano, Margaret could see Jake struggling to reach his fallen gun with his good arm. If he managed to retrieve it, she would be facing 3 armed opponents again instead of 2. That couldn't be allowed to happen. Margaret's fourth shot caught Jake in the leg as he stretched toward his weapon. He screamed and rolled away from the gun, clutching his new wound. Now he was completely out of the fight, bleeding from 2 locations and unable to move effectively. 2 shots left. 2 active enemies. The math was getting tight, but Margaret had been in worse situations before. The flanking man had worked his way around to the kitchen entrance and was trying to get behind her. Danny was moving closer with a shotgun, using the furniture for cover. They were executing a classic pincer movement, trying to trap her between them with nowhere to run. What they didn't understand was that Margaret wasn't trying to run. She was exactly where she wanted to be. The old grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10 times, marking the hour. As the last chime faded, Margaret made her move. She rolled out from behind the piano, not away from her attackers, but directly toward Danny with the shotgun. The move was so unexpected, so completely contrary to normal defensive tactics, that Danny hesitated for a crucial half-second. In that moment of confusion, Margaret's fifth shot took him center mass. The shotgun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as Danny collapsed. The flanking man had a clear shot now, Margaret exposed in the middle of the room with nowhere to take cover. His pistol came up, finger tightening on the trigger. Margaret's last bullet found him before he could fire. The living room fell silent except for the sound of Jake's labored breathing and the tick of the grandfather clock. Margaret remained in a crouch for several seconds, listening for any sound that might indicate a fifth man approaching from outside. Nothing. She rose slowly, the empty revolver still in her hand. 3 men lay dead in her living room. Jake Thompson, the gang's leader, was alive but badly wounded and no longer a threat. That left 1 man unaccounted for, the one who had been standing guard outside. Margaret moved to the front window and peered through the curtains. The street appeared empty, but she knew better than to assume the fifth man had fled. He might be positioning himself for an ambush, waiting for her to emerge from the house. Or he might have gone for help. Either way, Margaret needed to be ready. She opened the cylinder of her revolver and shook out the empty brass casings, then reached into her pocket for the 6 fresh cartridges she had prepared earlier that evening. Her fingers showed no tremor as she reloaded, the motion automatic after decades of practice. Jake was watching her with a mixture of pain and disbelief. Who are you?" he gasped. Margaret looked down at him with the same expression she had worn 30 years ago when explaining to criminals that their luck had run out. "I'm the widow you thought you were going to rob," she said quietly. "I'm the helpless old woman you planned to kill. I'm the person you should have left alone." She moved to the phone and dialed 911, never taking her eyes off Jake Thompson or the front windows where the fifth man might appear at any moment. 911, what's your emergency? This is Margaret Thompson at 1247 Elm Street. I've just killed 3 men who broke into my house, and I have a 4th one who needs an ambulance. You want to send Sheriff Morrison and probably call the state police. The Thompson gang picked the wrong house tonight. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone with barely controlled excitement. "Ma'am, did you say you killed 3 members of the Thompson gang?" "That's correct," Margaret replied calmly, keeping her eyes on the windows while she spoke. 3 are dead. 1 is wounded and no longer a threat. There's a 5th man who is standing guard outside. I don't know his current location. Mrs. Thompson, please stay on the line. We're sending units immediately. Are you injured? I'm Phoenix. Margaret moved away from the window, using the wall for cover while she maintained her vigil. The wounded man needs medical attention, but he's not going anywhere. In the distance, she could hear sirens approaching. Sheriff Morrison's department was small, but efficient, and the state police barracks was only 20 minutes away. Help was coming, but Margaret wasn't relaxing her guard until she knew the 5th man was accounted for. Jake Thompson was trying to sit up against the wall, his face pale from blood loss. "This isn't possible," he muttered through gritted teeth. "You're just an old lady. We researched you. We watched you." Margaret glanced at him with something that might have been amusement. "What exactly did your research tell you about me?" Margaret Thompson, 68 years old, widow, worked as a secretary before she got married. Lives alone, no criminal record, no weapons permits on file. Jake's voice was getting weaker, but his confusion seemed to be giving him strength. "There's nothing in your background to suggest you could do this. Your research was incomplete," Margaret said simply. She could have explained about Margaret Riley, about the 3 years she had spent infiltrating Chicago's most dangerous criminal organizations. She could have told him about the 7 men who had died before tonight, about the reputation that had made veteran cops speak her name with respect and fear. But Jake Thompson was dying, and the truth would die with him. Some secrets were meant to stay buried. The sirens were getting closer now. Margaret could see the reflection of red and blue lights beginning to paint the walls of her living room. Sheriff Morrison would be here soon, along with paramedics for Jake and a coroner for the other three. Margaret walked to the mantelpiece and placed the wooden box on the coffee table. She opened it and carefully placed the revolver back in its velvet-lined resting place, along with the remaining 5 cartridges. When the police arrived, she wanted to be clearly unarmed and cooperative. "You're making a mistake," Jake said, his voice growing weaker. "Billy's still out there. He'll come for you. He'll come for everyone in this town. Billy doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." Margaret looked at him with the patience of someone who had heard similar threats before. "Billy is welcome to try, but he might want to consider what happened to his 4 friends before he makes that decision." Car doors slammed outside, followed by the sound of boots on the front porch. "Mrs. Thompson?" Sheriff Morrison's voice called out. "It's Sheriff Morrison. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Sheriff. The front door is open. Come in slowly. I don't want anyone to get hurt by accident." Sheriff Morrison entered the house with his weapon drawn, followed by 2 deputies and a paramedic. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. 3 bodies scattered around Margaret's living room, blood on the walls and furniture, and Margaret herself standing calmly beside her coffee table as if nothing unusual had happened. "Sweet Jesus," one of the deputies whispered. Sheriff Morrison holstered his weapon and stared at Margaret with a mixture of respect and disbelief. "Mrs. Thompson, what happened here?" Margaret gestured toward the wounded man against the wall. "That's Jake Thompson, the gang's leader. He needs medical attention, but he's not dangerous anymore. The other 3 broke into my house with the intention of robbing and killing me. I defended myself." The paramedic rushed to Jake's side and began assessing his wounds. 2 gunshot wounds, he reported. Shoulder and leg. He's lost a lot of blood, but he'll live if we get him to the hospital. Sheriff Morrison was looking around the room, trying to piece together what had happened. "Mrs. Thompson, these men were armed and dangerous. How did you manage to?" He gestured helplessly at the 3 bodies. Margaret picked up the wooden box from the coffee table and showed him the revolver inside. "My late husband left me this for protection. I've always known how to use it." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Robert had indeed left her the gun, but only because she had asked him to put it in his will. The revolver had been hers long before she met him, and he had never known about its history or her skill with it. "You shot 4 men with a revolver?" "6 shots, 6 hits," Margaret replied matter-of-factly. "I don't believe in wasting ammunition." Sheriff Morrison shook his head in amazement. He had known Margaret Thompson for years, had always thought of her as a typical small-town widow who spent her time gardening and volunteering at the church. The woman standing before him now was clearly someone else entirely. "Ma'am, I have to ask, do you have any military or law enforcement background? Because what happened here?" He gestured at the precise placement of each shot, the tactical positioning of the bodies, the complete lack of panic or wasted motion. "This isn't luck. This is training." Margaret met his eyes steadily. "Sheriff, I'm a 68-year-old grandmother who defended her home against criminals. That's all you need to know for your report." Before Sheriff Morrison could respond, one of his deputies called from the front door. "Sheriff, we've got another problem. There's a 5th gang member unaccounted for, and we just found a car about 2 blocks away with the engine still running. Looks like someone left in a hurry." Billy Grimes crouched behind the old storage building at the edge of town, his hands shaking as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. He had been standing guard by the cars when he heard the first gunshot from inside the house. Then more shots, screams, silence. Billy was the youngest member of the Thompson gang at 23, and he had joined them more for the excitement than the money. Robbing banks and convenience stores had seemed like an adventure, a way to prove he was tough enough to run with dangerous men. But this wasn't fun anymore. This was a nightmare. He had watched through the living room window as that old lady systematically killed 3 of his friends and wounded Jake. She moved like a professional, like someone who had been trained to kill efficiently and without hesitation. Billy had seen enough war movies to recognize the difference between a lucky amateur and someone who knew exactly what they were doing. When the sirens started approaching, Billy had panicked and run. He was supposed to be the lookout, supposed to warn the others if trouble was coming. Instead, he had abandoned them and fled into the darkness like a scared child. Now he was alone, hiding behind a building 2 miles from the scene, trying to figure out what to do next. The smart thing would be to keep running, to get as far away from Millbrook as possible, and never looked back. But Jake's words kept echoing in his mind. Billy doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. Jake had been like a father to Billy, had taken him in when he was living on the streets, and given him purpose, belonging, family. The Thompson gang was the only real family Billy had ever known. And now 3 of them were dead, killed by a woman who was supposed to be an easy target. Billy pulled out his cell phone and dialed 411. "Give me the number for Margaret Thompson on Elm Street in Millbrook." He wasn't thinking clearly, wasn't considering the consequences. All he could think about was revenge, about making the old woman pay for what she had done to his family. Billy Grimes had never killed anyone before, but that was about to change. Back at Margaret's house, the scene was controlled chaos. State police had arrived and taken over the investigation, along with forensics teams and additional paramedics. Jake Thompson had been stabilized and was being loaded into an ambulance for transport to the county hospital under police guard. Detective Sarah Chon of the state police was interviewing Margaret in the kitchen while crime scene technicians processed the living room. Chon was a 20-year veteran who had seen her share of home invasion shootings, but she had never encountered anything quite like this. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to understand the sequence of events. You say you were sitting in your living room when the men broke in." "That's correct." Margaret had positioned herself where she could see both the detective and the windows. The 5th gang member was still unaccounted for, and her instincts told her he might not be finished yet. "And you had your weapon with you at the time?" "I had heard reports that the Thompson gang was in the area. Sheriff Morrison had called to warn me. I thought it was prudent to be prepared." Detective Chun made notes on her pad. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment suggests that each shot was precisely placed for maximum effectiveness. That level of accuracy under stress suggests considerable training or experience. Margaret sipped her coffee and said nothing. "Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask, have you ever been in a situation like this before?" "Detective, I'm a grandmother who defended her home against criminals. I did what I had to do to survive. Isn't that enough?" Before Chun could respond, her radio crackled to life. "Detective Chun, we've got a situation. The 5th suspect, Billy Grimes, just called Mrs. Thompson's house. The call was traced to a location about 2 miles east of here. He made threats against Mrs. Thompson specifically." Margaret set down her coffee cup with steady hands. "What kind of threats?" "He says he's coming back for you. Says you killed his family, and now he's going to kill yours." Margaret felt the familiar cold settling over her. Billy Grimes was young, inexperienced, and emotional, the most dangerous kind of opponent because he wouldn't think rationally or retreat when he should. He would keep coming until either he was dead or she was. "Detective, I'd like to make a phone call to my daughter in California." "Of course. But, Mrs. Thompson, we're going to provide protection for you. We'll have officers here around the clock until Grimes is apprehended." Margaret almost smiled. "I appreciate that, Detective. But I think we both know that Billy Grimes isn't going to wait for your officers to catch him. He's coming here probably tonight, and he's coming to kill me. We'll be ready for him." "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "We will." An hour later, most of the official personnel had left. The bodies had been removed, the crime scene had been documented, and Jake Thompson was in surgery at the county hospital. 2 state police officers remained to guard the house, positioned in an unmarked car across the street. Margaret sat in her kitchen, the revolver once again loaded and resting on the table beside her. She had called Sarah in California and told her a sanitized version of the evening's events, that there had been a break-in, that she was fine, that the police had everything under control. Sarah had wanted to fly out immediately, but Margaret had convinced her to wait until things settled down. The phone rang at midnight. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson." The voice was young, male, and shaking with rage. "My name is Billy Grimes. You killed my brothers tonight." "They weren't your brothers," Margaret replied calmly. "They were criminals who chose to invade my home. They knew the risks." "Shut up." Billy's voice cracked with emotion. "You don't know anything about us. Jake saved my life, gave me a family when I had nothing. Marcus and Danny were my friends, and you murdered them." Margaret listened to the pain in his voice and felt something unexpected, a touch of sympathy. Billy Grimes was barely more than a child, lost and angry and looking for someone to blame for his pain. In other circumstances, she might have tried to help him find a better path. But he had made his choice when he joined a gang of killers, and he was making it again now by calling to threaten her life. "Billy," she said gently, "you have a choice to make. You can walk away from this, start over somewhere else, build a real life for yourself. Or you can come after me and end up like your friends. I'm coming for you, old woman. Tonight. And this time, you won't see me coming." The line went dead. Margaret set down the phone and looked out the kitchen window. Somewhere in the darkness, a young man was preparing to make the last mistake of his life. She felt no pleasure in the knowledge, only the cold certainty that she would do whatever was necessary to survive. Margaret Thompson had been one-shot Riley for 3 years in Chicago, and she had been a peaceful grandmother for 30 years in Millbrook. Tonight, she was both, a woman who understood the value of life and the necessity of death, someone who could kill without hesitation and mourn without shame. Billy Grimes was about to learn the difference between a victim and a survivor. Unfortunately for him, the lesson would be his last. Margaret spent the hour after Billy's phone call preparing for what she knew would be the final confrontation. Unlike the earlier home invasion, this would be personal. Billy Grimes wasn't coming for money or valuables. He was coming for revenge, driven by grief and rage that would make him both more dangerous and more predictable. She moved through her house systematically, checking every possible entry point and sightline. The state police officers across the street were well-meaning, but they were positioned to intercept someone approaching by car or walking up the street. Billy had grown up on these streets before joining the gang. He would know every alley, every backyard, every way to approach a house without being seen from the front. Margaret turned off all the lights in the house except for a single lamp in the living room, clearly visible from outside. To Billy, it would appear that she was sitting in that room, probably reading or watching television, unaware of his approach. In reality, she had positioned herself in the dark kitchen with a clear view of all 3 possible routes into the house. The revolver lay on the kitchen table beside her, loaded and ready. But Margaret had also taken other precautions. She had scattered broken glass from a picture frame near the back door. Anyone stepping on it would announce their presence. She had positioned a mirror to give her a view around the corner into the dining room. Most importantly, she had called Detective Chun and informed her of Billy's threat and his probable approach route. The trap was set. Now all she had to do was wait. At 1:30 a.m., Margaret heard the first sound, a soft scraping from the direction of the basement. Billy was trying to enter through the old storm doors, the same ones that had been chained shut when the gang first arrived. But Margaret knew those chains could be cut with the right tools, and Billy had probably gone back to their abandoned car to retrieve bolt cutters or a hacksaw. She listened carefully, tracking his progress through the basement by the sound of his footsteps on the concrete floor. Billy was trying to be quiet, but he was moving too fast, letting his anger and adrenaline override his caution. He reached the basement stairs and began climbing toward the kitchen door. Margaret had deliberately left that door unlocked. She wanted Billy to feel confident, to believe he was succeeding in his surprise attack. Overconfident enemies made mistakes, and mistakes were something she could exploit. The kitchen door opened slowly, barely making a sound. Margaret could see Billy's silhouette against the dim light from the basement stairwell, tall and thin, moving with the nervous energy of youth and inexperience. He had a pistol in his hand, probably the same cheap automatic that most gang members carried. Billy stepped into the kitchen and froze. In the lamp light from the living room, he could see Margaret sitting in what appeared to be Robert's old chair, her back to him, apparently unaware of his presence. What Billy couldn't see was that Margaret had positioned a coat and had to create the silhouette of someone sitting in the chair. The real Margaret was crouched beside the kitchen counter, watching his every move. Billy raised his pistol and crept toward the living room, his finger already on the trigger. He was planning to walk up behind Margaret and shoot her in the back of the head. No warning, no conversation, just execution. At 23 years old, Billy Grimes was about to commit his first murder. Margaret waited until he was completely committed to his approach, until he had passed the point where he could retreat to the basement quickly. Then she stood up behind him and spoke quietly. "Hello, Billy." Billy spun around so fast he almost lost his balance. His pistol came up toward Margaret, but she was already moving. Her revolver appeared in her hand, as if by magic. The barrel centered on Billy's chest before he could complete his turn. "Don't," Margaret said simply. For a moment, they faced each other across the kitchen, the young man with fury and grief written across his face, the elderly woman with the cold calm of someone who had done this before. Billy's gun was pointed in Margaret's general direction, but Margaret's revolver was aimed with surgical precision at the center of his torso. "You killed them," Billy said, his voice breaking. "Jake was like a father to me. Danny and Marcus were my friends. They were the only family I ever had." Margaret kept her gun steady. "They chose to break into my house, Billy. They chose to threaten my life. I defended myself. They were good people. Good people don't invade homes and murder elderly widows for money," Margaret replied. "Good people don't rob banks and kill security guards. Your family were criminals, Billy, and criminals accept certain risks." Billy's hand was shaking, making his aim erratic. Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out on his face, grief warring with survival instinct, anger fighting against the growing realization that he was outmatched. "You don't understand," he said. "Jake found me when I was living under a bridge, eating out of garbage cans. He gave me clothes, food, a place to sleep. He taught me how to be strong, how to take care of myself. He taught you how to be a criminal. He taught me how to be a man." Margaret felt another unexpected pang of sympathy. Billy Grimes was a victim too, in his way, a lost child who had been taken in by predators and shaped into something he didn't have to become. But sympathy wouldn't stop a bullet, and Billy was still pointing a gun at her. "Billy," she said gently, "you're 23 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't throw it away for the sake of men who would have gotten you killed eventually anyway. I can't just let this go. They were my family. They were criminals who used you. Do you think Jake cared about you when he recruited a teenage runaway? Do you think he was looking out for your best interests when he taught you to rob and steal?" Billy's face contorted with confusion and pain. "He saved me. He destroyed you. He took a desperate child and turned him into a killer. Look at yourself, Billy. You're standing in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, pointing a gun at a grandmother. Is this who you wanted to become?" For a moment, Margaret thought she might be getting through to him. Billy's gun wavered, his certainty shaken by her words. But then his face hardened again, grief and rage reasserting control. "It doesn't matter what they were. They're dead because of you, and now you're going to pay." Billy's finger tightened on the trigger. Margaret could see the decision crystallizing in his eyes, the moment when talking ended and violence began. She had maybe half a second before he fired. Margaret didn't want to kill Billy Grimes. He was young, misguided, more victim than predator despite the weapon in his hands. But she had learned long ago that wanting and necessity were different things entirely. The revolver bucked in her hands once. Billy's shot went wild, punching a hole in the wall 6 inches from Margaret's head. He looked down at his chest with surprise, as if he couldn't understand what had happened. The pistol slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. "Why?" he whispered, blood beginning to foam at his lips. Margaret knelt beside him as he collapsed, her training automatically checking for signs that he might still be dangerous. But Billy was finished. Her shot had found his heart with the same precision that had ended 7 other lives in Chicago 30 years ago. "Because you wouldn't walk away," she said softly. "Because you chose revenge over redemption. Because sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones." Billy's eyes were already glazing over. Tell Jake I tried. I'll tell him," Margaret promised, though she knew Billy couldn't hear her anymore. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the old clock in the living room and the distant sound of sirens approaching. Someone had heard the gunshots, probably one of the state police officers keeping watch from across the street. Margaret stood slowly, her joints protesting after the sudden movement and tension. She was getting too old for this kind of activity, though her reflexes and accuracy remained as sharp as ever. 8 men had died at her hands now, spanning 3 decades and 2 very different lives. She walked to the phone and dialed Detective Chin's direct number. "This is Margaret Thompson. Billy Grimes is dead. He broke into my house through the basement and tried to kill me. I defended myself." Detective Chin's voice was tight with fatigue and stress. "Are you injured, Mrs. Thompson?" "I'm fine. You want to send the coroner and the crime scene team again?" "And detective? This is the last one. The Thompson gang is finished." Margaret hung up the phone and returned to the kitchen, where Billy Grimes lay in a spreading pool of blood. She looked down at his young face, peaceful now in death, and felt the familiar mixture of regret and relief that came after justified killing. Billy had been given a choice and had made the wrong one. Margaret had been forced to choose between his life and her own, and she had chosen survival. It wasn't a decision she took lightly, but it wasn't one she regretted either. 20 minutes later, Margaret's house was once again filled with police officers, paramedics, and crime scene technicians. Detective Chun arrived looking like she hadn't slept in 36 hours, which was probably close to the truth. "Mrs. Thompson, this is becoming a pattern." Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her revolver back in its wooden box on the mantelpiece. "Detective, I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to live quietly in my own home." "I know. And legally, you're completely in the clear. 5 armed criminals broke into your house with the intent to rob and kill you. You defended yourself with appropriate force. No prosecutor in the country would even consider filing charges." Detective Chun sat down across from Margaret, studying her with tired but sharp eyes. "But I have to ask again, who are you really? Because what happened here tonight, what happened earlier with the gang, this isn't normal. This is the work of someone with extensive training and experience." Margaret met her gaze steadily. "I'm exactly who I appear to be, Detective. A grandmother who knows how to protect herself. Mrs. Thompson, in my 20 years of law enforcement, I've seen maybe 3 or 4 shootings this clean. Perfect shot placement, tactical awareness, complete emotional control under extreme stress. Those skills don't come from nowhere. Sometimes people surprise you." Detective Chin leaned back in her chair, clearly frustrated but also respectful. "The FBI is going to want to talk to you. The elimination of the entire Thompson gang in one night is going to generate a lot of interest in Washington." Margaret nodded. She had expected this. The Thompson gang had been a federal priority because of their bank robberies and interstate crimes. Their sudden and complete destruction would raise questions that couldn't be easily answered. "I'll cooperate fully with any investigation," Margaret said. "But, Detective, I hope you understand that some stories are better left untold." "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes a legend is more useful than the truth. Let people think that a determined grandmother got lucky and managed to defend her home. It's a better story than the alternative." Detective Chin stared at her for a long moment. "What is the alternative, Mrs. Thompson?" Margaret smiled for the first time all night. "The alternative is that the most dangerous person in this county isn't a gang of criminals. It's an elderly widow with a revolver that has never missed when it mattered." Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to appear on the horizon. It would be a beautiful day in Millbrook, peaceful and quiet now that the Thompson gang was no longer a threat. Children would walk to school safely, families would sleep soundly in their homes, and life would return to the gentle rhythm that small towns were supposed to enjoy. Margaret Thompson would go back to being what she had always appeared to be, a quiet grandmother who tended her garden, attended church on Sundays, and called her daughter in California every week. The wooden box would return to the mantelpiece, and the revolver would rest in its velvet lining, waiting patiently for the next time it might be needed. But somewhere in the files of the FBI, the Chicago Police Department, and the state police, there would be records of a woman named Margaret Riley who had once been one shot and who had never missed when innocent lives were at stake. Those records would be classified, restricted, available only to those with the highest security clearances. And in the quiet town of Millbrook, the story would be told and retold of the night when 5 dangerous criminals made the mistake of underestimating a widow with a rusty old revolver. The gun would become more famous than the woman who used it, which was exactly how Margaret preferred it. Some heroes were meant to be remembered. Others were meant to be forgotten, leaving behind only the peace they had fought to protect and the lives they had saved with their sacrifice. Margaret Thompson was the second kind of hero, and as the sun rose over her small town, she was already planning what to plant in her garden that spring. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Margaret Thompson stood in her garden, hands deep in the rich soil as she planted tomatoes for the coming summer. The morning was bright and warm, filled with the sounds of a town that had returned to its peaceful rhythms. Children rode their bicycles down Elm Street, dogs barked playfully in neighboring yards, and the mail carrier whistled as he made his rounds. The events of that winter night had become legend in Millbrook. The story had grown with each telling, as stories often do. Some versions had Margaret shooting all 5 gang members in a blazing gunfight that lasted 20 minutes. Others claimed she had set elaborate traps throughout her house like something from a spy movie. A few of the more creative storytellers insisted that Margaret had been a secret agent or professional assassin in her younger days. Margaret listened to these tales with quiet amusement whenever she overheard them at the grocery store or post office. The truth had become buried beneath layers of embellishment and speculation, which was exactly what she had hoped would happen. People needed their legends, their stories of ordinary citizens rising to extraordinary circumstances. The reality of One-Shot Riley was too complex, too dark for a small town that wanted to believe in simple justice. The FBI investigation had lasted 6 weeks. Agent Patricia Mills, a veteran investigator from the regional office, had interviewed Margaret 3 times, each session lasting several hours. Agent Mills was thorough, professional, and clearly frustrated by Margaret's consistent responses. "Mrs. Thompson, your shooting accuracy that night was beyond anything we've seen from civilian defenders. You placed 8 shots with perfect precision under extreme stress. That level of skill typically requires military or law enforcement training." Margaret had maintained her story throughout each interview. "Agent Mills, my husband taught me to shoot when we were first married. I've been practicing with that revolver for 40 years. When my life was threatened, I did what I had to do." The ballistics report shows that every shot was placed for maximum effectiveness. The medical examiner's findings indicate professional-level knowledge of anatomy and tactics. "I aimed for center mass, just like anyone would in a self-defense situation." Agent Mills had eventually given up, unable to find any official record of Margaret Riley or any connection between the mild-mannered widow and any law enforcement agency. The records of Margaret's undercover work had been sealed and classified decades ago, accessible only through channels that Agent Mills didn't know existed. The investigation was officially closed with a finding of justified self-defense. The Thompson gang was eliminated, 5 dangerous criminals were off the streets, and a heroic grandmother had defended her home against impossible odds. It was a neat, satisfying conclusion that everyone could accept. Everyone except Agent Mills, who left Millbrook convinced that there was much more to Margaret Thompson than met the eye. The media attention had been intense, but brief. For 2 weeks, reporters from newspapers and television stations had descended on Millbrook, eager to interview the guardian angel of Elm Street, as one tabloid had dubbed her. Margaret had graciously declined all requests for interviews, citing her desire for privacy and her wish to return to normal life. The story had faded from the headlines as newer tragedies and sensations captured public attention. But for the people of Millbrook, Margaret had become something more than a neighbor. She was a symbol of strength, proof that ordinary people could overcome extraordinary threats when pushed to their limits. Margaret finished planting her tomatoes and moved on to the flower bed along the front of the house. The living room windows had been replaced, the bullet holes patched, and the bloodstains removed from the hardwood floors. The house looked exactly as it had before that February night, but Margaret knew it would never feel quite the same. She had been changed by the experience too, though in ways that weren't immediately visible. The adrenaline and muscle memory of combat had awakened something that had been dormant for 30 years. 4 weeks after the shooting, Margaret had found herself automatically checking sight lines when she entered a room, noting exit routes and potential threats with the instinctive awareness of someone whose survival had once depended on such vigilance. Those habits were fading now, settling back into the unconscious background where they had rested for 3 decades. Margaret was returning to the woman she had chosen to become when she left Chicago, a peaceful grandmother whose greatest concern was whether her roses would bloom properly this year. But the revolver remained on the mantelpiece, cleaned and ready, waiting patiently in its wooden box. A car pulled up in front of the house, and Margaret looked up to see a familiar figure emerging from the driver's seat. Sheriff Morrison approached with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had something important to say. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson. Beautiful day for gardening." "Good morning, Sheriff. What brings you by?" Sheriff Morrison glanced around the quiet street, then lowered his voice. "I want to give you a heads up about something. We got word yesterday that there's going to be a documentary made about what happened here. Some television producer from Los Angeles wants to tell the story of how you stopped the Thompson gang." Margaret continued planting flowers, her expression unchanged. "I hope they find more interesting subjects for their documentary. They're calling it The Widow's Stand, How One Woman Saved a Town. They want to interview you, film inside your house, recreate the whole thing with actors." "And what did you tell them?" "That you weren't interested in publicity." "But, Mrs. Thompson, they can make the documentary whether you cooperate or not. They can interview neighbors, use public records, film the outside of your house. There's not much we can do to stop them." Margaret considered this information while she worked. A documentary would bring renewed attention, more reporters, more questions about her background and abilities. It would make her a public figure, which was the last thing she wanted. Sheriff, what would you say if I told you I was thinking of moving? Sheriff Morrison looked genuinely distressed. Mrs. Thompson, you've lived here most of your adult life. This is your home. Don't let some Hollywood producer drive you away. Margaret smiled at his concern. I wouldn't be driven away, Sheriff. But my daughter has been asking me to move closer to her family in California. Maybe it's time I considered that seriously. The whole town would hate to lose you, especially after what you did for us. What I did was defend my home. Nothing more, nothing less. Sheriff Morrison studied her for a moment, and Margaret could see him struggling with something. Finally, he spoke. Mrs. Thompson, can I ask you something that's been bothering me for months? Of course. That night, when I arrived at your house, you seemed calm. Not shaken up, not traumatized, just calm and controlled. Like someone who had been through that kind of situation before. And the way you handled those weapons, the precision of your shots, it was professional level work. Margaret looked up from her flowers and met his eyes. Sheriff, sometimes people surprise themselves with what they're capable of when their lives are threatened. Is that really all it was? Survival instinct and luck? Margaret stood slowly, brushing soil from her hands. Sheriff Morrison, what would you say if I told you I used to be a police officer in Chicago? His eyes widened. I'd say that would explain a lot. And what if I told you I was a secretary who never held a gun until my husband taught me to shoot? I'd say that would be one hell of a natural talent. Margaret smiled. Which story would you rather believe? Sheriff Morrison considered the question carefully. I guess I'd rather believe that you're exactly what you appear to be. A brave woman who did what she had to do to protect herself and her community. Then, that's the story we'll stick with. That afternoon, Margaret received a phone call that she had been expecting. Mom? It's Sarah. I just saw something on the news about a documentary being made about you. Are you okay? Margaret settled into Robert's old chair, the same one where she had waited for the Thompson gang 3 months ago. I'm fine, honey. Just some television, people looking to make money off other people's misfortune. Mom, I've been thinking about this for weeks now. What happened to you is terrifying, but it could happen again. There are other criminals out there, other dangerous people. I can't stand the thought of you living alone and vulnerable. Sarah, please, Mom, come stay with us. At least for a while. David and the kids would love to have you here, and you'd be safe. Margaret looked around the living room where she and Robert had spent so many peaceful evenings, where she had raised her daughter, where she had waited in the darkness for killers to come. It was filled with memories, both beautiful and terrible. Let me think about it, honey. Really? You're actually considering it? Margaret could hear the hope in her daughter's voice. Really? I'm not getting any younger, and gardening in California sound appealing. They talked for another hour about practical details, selling the house, moving possessions, finding a place near Sarah's family. Margaret found herself genuinely interested in the idea of starting fresh somewhere new, of becoming just another grandmother without a legendary past. After hanging up the phone, Margaret walked to the mantelpiece and opened the wooden box. The revolver lay in its velvet lining, the metal still gleaming despite its age. She lifted it carefully, feeling its familiar weight one last time. 8 men had died at the end of this gun's barrel. 7 in Chicago during her undercover days. 5 more on the night the Thompson gang chose the wrong house to rob. Each death had been necessary, justified, the only choice available to protect innocent lives or her own. But Margaret was tired of necessary deaths. She was tired of being the person others turned to when violence was the only answer. She had done her duty as one-shot Riley in Chicago, and she had done it again as Margaret Thompson in Millbrook. Now she wanted to spend whatever years remained to her as simply Margaret, grandmother, gardener, woman of peace. She place.